Hello and welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be talking about emulation, but specifically retro front ends. But first, a word from our sponsor. You know, do you ever have itchy balls? Who the hell am I kidding? No one's watching this shit. I have like 30 subscribers, so I have no sponsors. Let's just move on with the video. So today I wanted to talk about retro front ends, mostly front ends for the PC. But before I start, some of you might need to understand a little bit about emulation, what it is, and why it's so important to retro things. Emulation is the practice of playing video games, especially retro video games, on devices they were never intended for, like a computer or a Raspberry Pi. Think about playing some of your old PlayStation 2 games, Sega Saturn games, ScumVM games, Apple games, on a computer, a modern piece of hardware. Today you can emulate just about anything, up to and including your Nintendo Switch. The legality of emulation has always been a gray area. I did a whole video about that. But basically, emulation allows a whole library of video games to open up for retro gamers to be able to experience some old games they might never have gotten to play otherwise. And if you look at the third-party aftermarket at sites like eBay, sometimes these old game cartridges go for hundreds of dollars and are just not affordable for your average collector. And let's be clear about this, the very act of emulation is not illegal. Anytime you're playing an old compilation disc on a modern piece of hardware, you're basically playing some form of emulation that was created by the manufacturer of those games.
I don't want this to go too far into the technical side of things, but if you have a modest gaming PC, you can run not only AAA PC games, but just about any game dating back to the 70s, such as games for the Atari 2600. And back in the 90s, when emulation was a new thing, your only option was pretty much a keyboard. But rest assured, you can hook up just about any controller to your PC and the games will run just like they did on your old CRT television. And most emulators give you a ton of options. You can upscale your old games to 1080p or even 4K and add neat filters to give your games that cool CRT look. The thing with emulators is that if there are a variety of systems that you want to emulate, chances are you'll need several different emulators. And each emulator has its own specific file system, its own unique setup, and essentially every time you want to play a different system, different steps are needed. Of course, there exists software like RetroArch, which I'll get into in a minute, that package multiple emulators into one convenient setup. This is much more intuitive, but even RetroArch doesn't emulate everything. So let's say you have a hard drive filled with dozens of emulators. You don't want to have to browse through multiple folders each time you want to run a game, do you? Well, this is where front ends come into play. Think of a front end as a menu system that takes your clutter of emulators and ROMs, all your scattered folders and configuration files, and organizes it all into a clean, colorful-looking user interface where you simply select the game you want to play, and play. Yeah, that's it. I mean, all front ends are going to have their own unique setups, but once your emulators are configured inside the front end, you're good to go. You can have literally thousands of games easily accessible from a menu system. Think of it as your own personal Netflix, but for your retro games. Now, to be clear, this isn't a setup guide. This is just a highlight video showing you the basics of how each of these front ends look and how they work. By the end of the video, I'll tell you which front end I usually use, and I'll try to give you the pros and cons of each. First, there are two types of front ends.
Those that have integrated emulators and those that function independently of the emulators. Most of the front ends I've used actually use integrated emulators.
Sometimes this means the front end in question comes with its own emulators, and sometimes you have to download them yourself. But most of the time, regardless, you'll only have the option of updating the emulator within the front end itself. If you try to update the emulator outside of the front end, you might encounter an error running the games correctly, or the front end will automatically force you to use the version it wants you to use.
There is one on this list that uses independent emulators, and I'll go through that one last. So, without further ado, let's get started. Hopefully you'll learn something, and hopefully you'll have a lot of fun while watching.
The first one I'd like to bring up is RetroArch, which I mentioned already. Now, RetroArch is a weird one, and I hesitated to put it on this list because it essentially functions as both an emulator and a front end. It has many of the benefits of both. As a front end, it has a very clean aesthetic resembling the classic PS3 menu. Once you add your games, you can scrape them for metadata and grab all your artwork, create playlists, and browse by console. As far as emulation goes, you can basically emulate anything up to PlayStation 2. Within RetroArch, you'll need to download a specific core depending on what console you want to emulate. The cores are basically your emulators. For anything up to and including Sega Saturn, you should be good to go. However, in my experience, the more advanced platforms like PSP, PlayStation 2, Sega Dreamcast, Wii, and GameCube all function better with their respective standalone emulators. The reason I don't really count this as a dedicated front end is because, well, A lot of front ends use RetroArch as the default emulator anyways, and if you use the front ends I'm about to show you, you'll almost never have to deal with RetroArch in the first place, unless you want to change some setting. But it's a cool option and very convenient if you want a sort of all-in-one experience. It'll play 90% of your retro library just fine. So the first real front end I'm going to talk about is RetroBat. I like the look of this front end. It's very clean and has a lot of nice features. The menus are intuitive, and as long as you have the emulator installed, it's pretty easy to switch between emulators if one is working better than another. There are a ton of themes you can download, and it even has support for the bezel project if you like to run your retro games with bezels on the sides, as opposed to boring black bars. This is a great choice for those who don't want to spend a lot of time tinkering around. When you install RetroBat, all the ROM folders are created for you, and for the most part, all you need to do is copy your ROMs to their respective folder and play the games. It's that simple. However, you'll want to do your homework for the more advanced systems. PlayStation 3, for example, has a really weird file structure, and RetroBat doesn't like to run the actual game files anyway. It wants you to create .m3u files that point to the game files. It might sound confusing, but believe it or not, it comes with a tool that will automatically do this for you. All you have to do is point to where your game files are, and it'll create all the M3U files you need. Then, within RetroBat, you just pick the game you want to run, and you're set. RetroBat isn't perfect, though. First, the emulators are integrated into RetroBat, meaning that most of the options for each emulator can only be accessed through the RetroBat menu. This is great if, like I said, you don't want to tinker that much with standalone emulators, but sometimes not all of the emulation settings are included within RetroBat. Sometimes, not always mind you, but sometimes setting up a controller can be finicky. There's an option to let RetroBat automatically configure your controller for you, which works 90% of the time, but sometimes you might get a game that has a unique control scheme like most Wii games. For those, you'll want to disable the automatic configure option in RetroBat, then head over to, say, Dolphin, and configure the controls in there. Also, because the emulators are integrated, most of the updates are run through RetroBat. And if you try to update the emulator outside of RetroBat, sometimes it'll force you to revert back to an older version. This isn't a deal breaker, as a lot of times the latest update isn't that big of a deal, but there are plenty of emulators that get updated on a daily basis, and because the emulators are integrated within RetroBat, you don't always have that option. Also, some game systems have incredibly complex file systems. RetroBat has a pretty helpful wiki on how to set these systems up, and there are some really nice tutorials on YouTube. One I love to peruse is Just Jamie. He's the expert on setting up RetroBat. Just keep in mind that with RetroBat, if you don't have the specific version of the game you want, the emulator might have a problem playing it. A weird one that I like to check out from time to time is the American Laserdisc games. These were the full-motion video arcade games you saw in the late 80s to mid-90s. Most of them were gun games like Mad Dog McCree and Crime Patrol. I honestly have a fun time playing them. But recently, RetroBat received an update, and the emulator that runs these games, called Singe 2, was updated as well. Suddenly, the game files I used for the past year were incompatible, and I had to download the newest versions. And calm down, all of the Singe games are free to download, but I tend to download those games from the Internet Archive, and those versions don't seem to work with Singe 2 inside of RetroBat. I also sometimes have trouble getting standalone emulators to work. For example, ScumVM, which emulates those early 90s point-and-click games. I had the toughest time getting the standalone version of ScumVM to run in RetroBat. It kept telling me that it couldn't find the emulator, even though I downloaded it a dozen times. The RetroArch core seemed to work, but not all of my games seemed to run perfectly with it. I had to go in and futz about with the settings. In the latest release of RetroBat, ScumVM seems to work just fine, and emulators I usually have a problem with, like the Triforce fork of Dolphin, which runs the Mario Kart arcade games, worked fine without any hassle. So honestly, RetroBat is one I try, but only for your regular console games. The weird arcade-type games can be hit or miss. Although, if MAME is your thing, RetroBat should work just fine. The next one I want to talk about briefly is Emulation Station Desktop Edition, or Emulation Station DE for short. I don't have as much experience with this one, but if you use RetroBat, it's basically using Emulation Station in the back end. So this is a very similar experience. In some ways, Emulation Station isn't as finicky when loading your ROMs, but the initial setup is a little more complicated. When you first start it up, it wants you to point it to your existing emulator folders, and that gets tricky, especially when you're using RetroArch as your primary emulator. Still, I think I like the overall interface of Emulation Station more than I do RetroBat. It's very clean and also has some kick-ass themes you can download to get that awesome retro arcade look. There are so many themes for this thing, it can really seem overwhelming. From what I remember, adding games is just as easy as it is in RetroBat, and it's not as finicky because if I remember correctly, I think it's more versatile with what files you can use. For example, I didn't seem to have a problem with Singe or ScumVM games. And while the emulators are integrated in with the front end, I don't believe it's as finicky when you try to update the emulator outside of the front end, although that's speculation. I haven't played with it that much. However, one of the downsides to Emulation Station is that if you want to add in your own playlists like ROM hacks or those awesome MSU1 enhanced Super Nintendo games, you have to add them into the configuration file, and that's a pain in the ass. You really have to dig deep to add those, and I am not a coding type of guy. So if you know ahead of time that you're going to want to play some homebrew or hacked stuff, it'll do it, but it takes some additional work. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to run Technoparrot on it. There's no option for downloading the emulator, and I couldn't figure out how to launch the games from within Emulation Station. I looked everywhere online, and I couldn't figure it out. So basically, if you want a front end that runs everything, I don't know if Emulation Station is right for you. The last one, and the front end I use the most by far, is Launchbox. Now, I paid for the premium version, so I don't know what you get with the free version. I was under the assumption that you just don't get access to Big Box, but even with the free version, there are so many great features. My favorite thing right off the bat is that Launchbox is essentially just a game launcher. The emulators all function independently of the front end. That means you can update every emulator on its own, and Launchbox won't get hung up over it. And you don't have to worry about specific folder structures or complicated XML files. You point Launchbox to the emulator executable file, you point it to your game folder, and you're good to go. Even with the more advanced stuff like Singe, Technoparrot, ScumVM, PlayStation 3, there are tons of tutorials online for how you can create batch files to make launching these games easier, and all you have to do is point Launchbox to the batch files, and you're good to go. It has a built-in scraper. You don't have to log into Screen Scraper, which you have to do if you're using RetroBat. And as far as I know, there's no limit to how many images you can scrape. It'll scrape your games all day long if you want it to. Another cool thing is if you have a really large collection of, say, arcade games, Launchbox will scan your full ROM set and only import the games you'll want to play. You can tell it to avoid casino games, for example, or broken ROMs, or duplicates, or adult games that you don't want your kids to accidentally access. It'll weed through all of those and only import the things most important to you. And it even has an option to install RetroArch all on its own without you needing to worry about it. Here's something else that's pretty neat: how it handles duplicates of games. A lot of games might have different versions, especially when it comes to arcade games. You might have versions from another region, or you might have both a 2-player and a 4-player version of a game, like with The Simpsons or Ninja Turtles. But Launchbox gives you the option of combining those titles into one selection. Then, rather than having a screen littered with duplicate games, you have one tile, and when you right-click on the tile, you can select the specific version of the game you want to play. And if you want the priority to be the US version of the game, you can go into the settings and choose it as your priority. Of all the front ends I've used, Launchbox definitely does the best at organizing your library. It has options for automatically importing your Steam or GOG libraries, and you can even choose what kind of box art you want displayed. The possibilities are endless. Now, this is the vanilla version of Launchbox. It doesn't look as snazzy as RetroBat or Emulation Station. You can set it up to use your controller in the menu. I'm on a laptop, so I'm just using my mouse. But what's nice about this menu is it has a search bar. I have a really big collection, and even in RetroBat, if I search by letter, it'll still take me a while to search for the specific game I want. Here I can just type in, say, Mario, and it narrows down my search drastically. So there's that. Another feature I like is the ability to open up other programs before launching the game. I don't do this often, but there are some games that, for whatever reason, refuse to launch in full screen. Take this game, for example, Transformers Human Alliance. It's a perfectly fine rail shooter that runs on Technoparrot. It runs fine, but it only runs in windowed mode. There's this little program I found called Borderless Gaming, which will automatically resize any game into full screen. I could go and execute this program every time I launch the specific game, but I could also tell Launchbox to launch Borderless Gaming every time I launch Transformers, and there we go. Easy peasy, Pokemon cheesy. Now, as far as I know, all this is included with the free version of Launchbox, but here's what you get when you pay for it. This is Big Box. It essentially takes your game collection and gives it the RetroBat Emulation Station treatment. All the options you'd have with Launchbox are essentially here, just with a snazzier interface. There are tons of customization options here, but however you set your games up in Launchbox, they should run fine here too. You can even still select which version of the game you want to play. There aren't as many eye-catching themes with Big Box. Frankly, most of the ones I tried didn't really catch my interest, but you can still change the layouts easily enough. One thing I have to comment on is Big Box does feel a bit choppier than in the other two front ends, but that could just be because of the size of my library. I noticed that RetroBat can chug along too once you start adding tons of games and images. So there you have it. Launchbox is definitely my front end of choice. If you like having a ton of options within the front end, while still being able to get the full functions of the standalone emulators, there's nothing better. It's the only front end I've found that will play everything without issue, as long as you know how to set it up. But before I go, I want to call out a few popular front ends that pop up from time to time. I've messed around with things like CoinOps, RetroFE, and Hyperspin. These look great and you can do some amazing things with them, but they are extremely difficult to set up. They don't have built-in scrapers, which means you'll have to look up all the metadata, the video snaps, the box art, all that on your own time, and make sure they're all in the correct folders. And because they are difficult to set up, the best way to use them is to just download pre-built images online. Just be careful where you get the images from, because there are a lot of shady places out there. A lot of these images have preloaded packs you can buy, where you just drag the folders into your existing build and watch your library grow. It's fun to experiment with these pre-builds, but a lot of the time they take up a lot of hard drive space, and they're really hard to add games to if a pack doesn't include your favorite title. I bought this 12TB Kinhank Hyperspin drive, which is an insane thing. It looks great, if not a little too flashy for my taste. It takes me back to my early college days when I was just learning PowerPoint, and every click had a sound effect because I thought I was awesome. But the thing with Hyperspin is that it's a really weird, outdated setup. It basically uses these things called modules, which are like cores in RetroArch. Each emulator has its own module, but the modules only work with specific versions of said emulators. That means if on this drive I want to update, say, RPCS3, the PlayStation 3 emulator, to the latest version, chances are the games won't run inside of Hyperspin anymore because I don't have the corresponding module. So I wouldn't really recommend fresh builds of any of these. They aren't well documented, and you'll more than likely spend more time setting them up than you will playing games. And that's what you're here for, right? Anyway, this was fun. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to cover here, and as always, thanks for hanging out with me.